And do you remember where you were when this story first kind of came to you? Because like you said, that's a lot of reading. There's all these horrible stories. Do you remember where you were when you first, who did you come across first? Was it David or Tsippy?
So I came by the story as a total accident. I was actually looking for something else. I was doing research on how refugees arrived into the United States around World War II because it was such a difficult time to immigrate into the US. The quotas were so low. People didn't want to have foreigners here. And I was interested in how people were coming. And I know a lot of authors you've spoken with say that they get story ideas this way. But I started looking into the archives of the New York Times. I ran into the story about a little girl who got the first visa after World War II into the United States. She was 3 years old and she was adopted by an American soldier. So I saw this story and it was plastered in all the New York newspapers. It was in the cover of the Daily News, the Post, the Tribune, the Brooklyn Eagle, everything, the Times. And so I got curious what happened to this little girl, you know? It was such a nice story. So I started looking for her. And it took me, I think, about a year. I had a full-time job at the time and I was doing this research on the side and she had changed her name. Eventually I did find her. She was alive and well and had a family and I met her and she had saved this treasure trove of letters and documents from when she was in Berlin and from the soldier who adopted her. And it turned out that the story that had been printed back then about her arrival in the US wasn't as it looked. It was kind of propaganda. He had brought her over for someone else and he had arranged the whole thing, but he wasn't going to adopt her. He made up this story because he needed a feel-good story, something to get Americans okay with bringing this little girl in. So the story was so interesting. And it was, I love these stories that aren't what they seem. So I wrote this story for the Times. And after I wrote the story, I got intrigued and I wanted to find more stories like this. I thought this surely wasn't the only one. Someone told me I should meet David Wisnia. David had an interesting story I was told about how he came to the US. So I went to his house and he agreed to talk to me. And he told me about growing up in Warsaw and having this nice upbringing. He always loved singing and he dreamed of being an opera singer in the US one day. And then, you know, the war started and he was Jewish. And suddenly the world turns upside down, right? He's this boy who had everything and suddenly he's stuck in his apartment, can't go anywhere. Warsaw is being bombarded outside. And all of a sudden things change completely when the Nazis come in and he's part of the Warsaw ghetto, he and his family. He's now sleeping on the floor. He's not going to school anymore and he's working. So he told me about being in the Warsaw ghetto and one day finding his entire family killed. He was 15 years old. He was on his own, basically, from then on. He managed to escape the ghetto. He went to wherever he could get, basically. He went from ghetto to ghetto for a while, but eventually he was transported into Auschwitz. And he's telling me this story and it's incredible just how he managed to survive. And I'm picturing this 15-year-old boy completely alone in the world. By the time I met him, he was in his 90s, had a great sense of humor and just this zest for life. You know, you could feel how much he savored being alive. And then he tells me he was transported to Auschwitz and he had to carry corpses for a while of the dead. That was his job. And he survived for 3 years and then was on the death march out of Auschwitz when the war was coming to an end and managed to escape another death march, ran into American soldiers who adopted him and gave him an American uniform. Told him, you're one of us now, gave him a gun, taught him how to use the gun. And basically, he went from being a prisoner in Auschwitz to being someone who was interrogating Nazis with a gun in hand. And he arrived in the United States as an American soldier. So he told me the story and I was completely floored. And I stood up ready to leave the house. And he mentioned very casually, "Oh, I had this girlfriend in Auschwitz." And I sat back down. My recorder is still running. And I was kind of like, "Okay, tell me about this girlfriend." And he told me, "Yeah, I had this girlfriend and she was a graphic designer for Auschwitz. And she was a very special person. She was a Jewish woman and she was wonderful. And we were able to meet and have an affair." I didn't know that much about Auschwitz at the time, but I knew enough to understand that this sounded not right. So he's telling me the story and I'm kind of, I wasn't sure how much of this was true. And even, does this woman really exist? I thought, he's in his 90s. Maybe he's misremembering some things.
Yeah, this is definitely a fact-checking situation.
Right. But then he told me there's a book about her. That was written by historians. It's an academic book, and 5 different historians spoke with her and got her perspective on Auschwitz, and they each wrote from a different perspective. So I looked it up, and sure enough, this book existed, and this woman existed, and she was a graphic designer, and she was just this incredible character, incredible human, and I just wish I'd gotten a chance to meet her, but fortunately, she left a lot of testimony behind.